A special edition of Over a Barrel. And Patrick DeHaan, are we going to see prices next year higher or lower than this year?
Well, Matt, after a drum roll, we're expecting lower prices in 2024 than we saw this year.
This is a program I can get behind. Over a Barrel starts right now. Welcome to the program on Over a Barrel. I'm Matt McClain. Patrick DeHaan is live in Chicago. At least I think you're in Chicago. You kind of pop up just a little bit of everywhere across the globe. I never know exactly where you are. Are you in Chicago right now?
Well, Matt, I've got to shop around and report all those gas prices to the GasBuddy app, right? I mean, the gas prices have to come from somewhere. No, I think actually you and I both do that.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm back in Chicago this morning after doing some holiday driving. I filled up for less than $3. Hopefully you have as well, I'm sure, being much cheaper down there.
I paid $2.55 a gallon on Christmas Day. And,
$2.55?
Yes, wow, and also $2.63 because one tank wasn't enough.
Oh my goodness, I'm jealous.
Well, I mean, I was upset over the $2.63. That was the cheapest I could find, but nevertheless, in the spot that I was in. But I'll take both. They were quite happy pricing in my eyes. I got a little twinkle in my eye like Santa after I saw the price point.
That's terrific. And by the way, something I don't see here very often. It was a Christmas miracle. The station down the street from me in Chicago, as it turns out, temporarily lowered prices on Christmas. $2.99 a gallon, even here in Chicago. That was the same price basically across much of Michigan and Indiana as I drove from Grand Rapids back to Chicago. So, but of course, all good things coming to an end. The next day, Boxing Day, the 26th, they had raised prices back up to $3.39 a gallon. So turns out it was a one-stop discount on Christmas Day if you happen to be out and about. But you know what? Still better than paying $3.39 a gallon on Christmas.
Yeah, that's just it. I have noticed for the holidays, at least for me, and you keep telling me this never happens, but for whatever reason, the price always magically goes up on a holiday, and then the next day it magically goes back down, at least in my neck of the woods. And you keep telling me there's nothing abstract about that. It's just sort of what it is. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know.
You know, at least in this case, the wholesale price was certainly low enough. That was what's really frustrating about stations that in this case, my station was playing a little bit of a game with prices. And I don't know if they wanted to pull more traffic in on Christmas, given the fact that they had workers there anyway. But and by the way, back to that, I hope that people are cognizant of those C-store workers that made their holidays possible this year. As it turns out, I didn't go inside of the C-store to be able to thank those workers for helping me fill my tank. But I will say the pump I stopped at was a little broken, Matt. I was frustrated that one of the truck stops I stopped at, the loyalty program didn't work.
What?
So, yeah, it was just, broken pumps, the scanners, some of them have scanners now that can read UPCs, and I put in my rewards number for this particular brand, and it just hasn't worked. And I've reached out to them, and yeah, it's frustrating when you get to the pump and you're promised a discount and you put all your information in and it just keeps keying it back at you and putting you into a loop. So, but I still, I still got gas for $2.75 a gallon. So all in all, still not a loss. And hopefully everyone else out there has been able to fill up on the cheap, but prices have inched up a little bit. But hey, getting into the year ahead, we've got some good news though.
Yes, let's go ahead and get into our special report. I don't have any special music, unfortunately, for it, at least not handy. But let's talk about what you have released, which is very exciting. You do this every year. The annual report. It's actually more of a prediction, as well as information about the previous and current year, as well as previous years before that, dating back to 2013 or 14. So you have a lot of stuff going on. in this report, and I know that the news media is obviously abuzz with all of this and talking about it, and probably will for several days because there's so much information in there. What are some of the things that you want to highlight before we really dive in and talk about some of the finite details? But what are some of the things you want to highlight out of that?
Well, Matt, I think first and foremost, let's highlight the fact that everyone listening to the podcast is basically getting an exclusive. We're basically talking about it before it's being released, so enjoy it. It'll be in the media here in the days ahead and in the hours ahead. But for now, a way to thank all of our listeners to the podcast and getting access to this. But all in all, I think, Matt, for most Americans who look at 2024 and maybe a simple way, we'll tell you that things are looking a little bit better in 2024. It's not going to be quite the big drop, Matt, compared to what we saw between 2022 and 2023. The national average this year is closing out almost 50 cents lower than last year. There will be a drop in 2024. If you look at the average price over the course of the year, we are expecting it to be lower. That's the good news. But there's a lot of details with the seasonality, the ups and the downs, right? And so I want to make clear that through this yearly national average, we smooth out all of those increases and decreases. Right now, we're paying less than what we expect for the yearly national average. And then in the summer, of course, we're probably going to be paying a little bit more than the average. But all in all, Matt, the average household is going to be spending less on gasoline this year than they did in 2023, or excuse me, I should say in 2024, they're going to be paying less on gasoline. I have to remember, it's always like the week before New Year's, right, where you start using the next year as substitute. So most households will be spending less on gasoline in 2024 than we did in 2023.
I'm looking at your Outlook accuracy. I love the fact that you are as transparent as you are. For most years, you've kind of almost hit the price point right on the button. The one spot that I've seen, which is totally understandable, is whenever we had the pandemic. Obviously, you were not forecasting a pandemic. So
those were dumpster fire forecasts, Matt. I still get people saying, "How dare you for not predicting the pandemic?"
Right? I don't hold you responsible for that. Understandable. That. I mean, that's not your fault. 2020 and 2021.
But is it? Is it?
But not really. I can't blame you for the pandemic. Did not come from gasoline or oil. It is not your fault. But other than that, you've got a really good accuracy. I mean, to think about the idea, plucking out those 2 years aside and looking at the rest of them, that you sometimes were only off by a few pennies per gallon as the average when you're looking at it at a year in advance. Because when you stop and think about it, you and I are recording podcasts every week, and sometimes week to week, it's like, Patrick, I thought you said prices were going to fall, and they didn't. And you're like, yeah, they went up a little bit, and et cetera. So the fact that after a full 12 months, you're still coming back within just a few pennies on most years of your prediction versus actual, that's impressive to me. That shows a good amount of experience. So my hat's off to you, sir.
And let's go to those ugly years, Matt, and explain what went wrong. Obviously, in 2020, our forecast came out on New Year's Day of 2020, January 1. Of course, nobody would have anticipated at that point that we'd be in a full-blown pandemic for most of 2020. So we predicted a yearly average in 2020 that was $2.60 a gallon, and ended up being $2.17 a gallon. A lot of it because, from March through the rest of the year, the economy was drastically impacted by the pandemic shutting things down. So, I think the bigger surprise was 2021, and that was also a difficult prediction, Matt, because when we made that forecast on January 5th of 2021, vaccines were not yet widely available. In fact, I think the week prior, as I was putting the forecast together, because I often go to Michigan for the holidays, the first vaccine was rolling off the assembly line, so to speak, at Perigo down in Battle Creek. I remember that news story of the first semi-truck loaded with vaccines for COVID. And so 2021 was really difficult because we really didn't know the pace of vaccines, how, we knew the early efficacy numbers. We knew they were pretty effective, but we didn't know how quickly that would unleash right? The reopening of the economy. So 2021, we predicted a yearly national average of 244 a gallon. It jumped up to 302 because it was very difficult to predict how much speed the U.S. economy and then consumers would get back out there. So yeah, those are very difficult. But even to your point of how we jump on the podcast and like the Fed, right? We recently talked about how the Federal Reserve all of a sudden was a needle mover because Jerome Powell had signaled that the Fed could start cutting interest rates. And that's a big wild card, right? Because again, that is a critical detail moving forward on the pace of growth in the United States. Will we go back to a consumer that's very resilient and is ready to spend, or are we going to be cutting interest rates because of a greater slowdown in the economy? So, this year, sometimes you do get really close and sometimes you're a little bit off the mark. And again, I think that this year I was real happy with, given the amount of geopolitical issues that came up, like, constantly the Middle East, OPEC policy, that we were able to get within 2 pennies of, predicting spot on. We predicted 2023 would feature a yearly national average of 349, and we're closing at basically 350 and 9/10. So we're really close, but past performance is not always indicative of future performance. So I'd be real happy, Matt, if we could nail this next year forecast. And by the way, I suppose we can spill the beans on what we're expecting now for 2024, right?
Yes, let's get right into it.
So, yearly national average, GasBuddy in our forecast this year is expecting a decline of about 13 cents. We're going to go from about 351. We are expecting the yearly national average to drop to 338 a gallon. And we've been working on that number for a couple of weeks. So 338 a gallon is a drop of a little over 2%. It's not a massive decline, Matt, but it's more of a return to, close to norms. And by the way, something new that we did in our forecast, Matt, this year, in addition, if you haven't looked at the forecast, I would tell anyone to go to the GasBuddy website, go to gasbuddy.com/newsroom, or check our social channels. We're in the process of posting that right now as we speak. So check the social channels, the Over a Barrel podcast show, Over a Barrel show, that is, on Twitter. We'll post the link to the forecast there, but check it out month by month. We go down the average that we expect for every month. That's the national average. We also, Matt, what's new this year is we delved into predictions for each holiday so that people that want to make travel plans for Memorial Day will know what we're expecting and how much confidence we have in our forecast. And we also predicted, in addition to some of the largest metro areas, the worst it's going to get, we also predicted the yearly state average by state. So all 50 states, we give a range of what we expect the yearly national average to be. And again, that's a yearly national average. So Matt, the price will be higher some days in some of these states, and it will be lower than what we're expecting for the yearly national average. The state average forecast is really good if you want to budget for how much money you should set aside, right? Because over the year, it'll all average out. But all the numbers are there, Matt. Tons of numbers in this forecast, which 23 pages basically of details on gas prices.
So now my question to you, which is part of different aspects with regard to the report itself. This is a gasoline forecast. What about diesel?
Yeah, actually, a great question. This is a fuel outlook, and we do include diesel in there as well. In fact, the yearly average we expect for diesel this year, $3.87 a gallon. And currently, the national average is already under $4 a gallon for diesel. We do expect, Matt, over the course of the winter, January, February, March, we do expect, and April, that the average price for diesel could go back over $4, especially if we get some cold weather. But the rest of the year, Matt, from May through the rest of 2024, May through December, we expect that the national average for diesel will be below the $4 a gallon mark. In fact, we expect that by the end of 2024, the average for diesel could be in the mid to upper $3 a gallon range. So it's all there. Diesel forecast month by month, gasoline forecast month by month as well. So again, check out the report. These reports, by the way, this forecast, Matt, is meant to be read by people that basically have little to no background on oil markets, petroleum markets, or economics. So we've really tried to make this simple, because at the end of the day, this is for the Gas Buddy audience. This is, so many people have been reporting prices to us this year. This is a service that we provide so that we can return value to our users. You help us with gas prices, and we try to help you figure out how deep you're going to have to dig for gas prices in 2024.
So I mentioned this to you back in the summer. I'm going to chase after this rabbit for a good 30-second answer from you with regard to diesel, because it's generally meant for the consumer itself, the Gas Buddy audience. Very quickly, talk to me about why diesel is so much more expensive than gasoline. Because as you recall, I kind of set it up in the summer for you to answer the way that you did, because I said, isn't diesel just a derivative or, a byproduct of producing gasoline? Yeah. And you're like, no. And I'm like, I know, I'm asking on purpose. I want you to answer. So tell us very quickly why diesel is so much more expensive these days than gasoline.
Yeah. Well, Matt, there's really two reasons for diesel being so much more than gasoline right now. The two conditions are really the Russia war in Ukraine, right? Russia produces a lot of heavy oil, and heavy oil produces more heavy product like diesel. The U.S., on the other hand, produces a lot of lighter crude oil, which produces a lot of product like gasoline, which is lighter. So the Russian war in Ukraine is basically restricting Russia from being able to sell a lot of that heavy oil to satisfy the market needs. So diesel and heavier products are generally more expensive because of the Russian war in Ukraine than they would be if there was no war. Secondly, it's because that over the last decade, the regulations, the rules and requirements for diesel have been producing a lot of improvements in terms of emissions. Diesel is far cleaner now than it was, 15 years ago. Back in 2006, the standard changed that diesel must have less than 10 parts per million of sulfur. All that desulfurization, Matt, is incredibly costly. There's a finite amount of capacity. So it's really because diesel is much cleaner now, and it's because Russia's war in Ukraine. If I was to add a third thing as well, because diesel's more the fuel of commerce, right? Semis all over the place. The price of diesel also can be dependent on the economy, and as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, weather, right? If it's going to be a cold winter, that means more heating oil consumption. Heating oil and diesel are basically the same thing. So those are the two wild cards that can also impact the price of diesel. That's why diesel prices are generally more expensive in the summer. In the winter. Diesel is more expensive. Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, so that leads me into my next question, which is, let's go ahead and look at the United States and kind of break it down just a little bit. Are there areas or regions of the country that you are concerned when it comes to potential outages or even geopolitical disruptions? Let's talk about that for just a moment. What are you looking at in that crystal ball? Is it all snow? What do we have?
If you're out on the West Coast, you'll want to buckle up because just like last year when prices in most of California hit that $6 a gallon mark, there's still that potential, Matt, because California, though I'm hopeful it won't go as high, the problems that led to the spike in California and some areas of the West Coast and Arizona, by the way, some of the market deficiencies still exist. California is still a market that doesn't have enough refining capacity to be able to supply itself with all the gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel that it needs. So if there are, refinery issues, especially, Matt, if there's more than a couple refinery issues at once, that drastically changes what happens in California. In fact, we're actually in the middle of this right now. California had a couple unexpected refinery outages last week, and Matt, the retail price of California gasoline is now up 7 cents from a week ago. So refinery issues out west, pipeline constraints in Arizona are the things that would keep me up at night with this forecast. On the other side of things, if you're in the Gulf states, it's good news. Gas prices, gasoline taxes tend to be lowest in those areas. And I think you mentioned geopolitical, wild card.
I'm looking at basically page 17. If your outlook commentary there, where the East Coast is remaining highly susceptible to Talk to us about that.
Yeah, if you look at that slide 17 there, looking over, I mean, how many times, Matt, do we talk about gas prices? You can't really talk about gas prices without mentioning refineries, right? Refineries are the critical
Well, that's how
device.
oil becomes gasoline. So
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, without refineries, there's no gasoline. So it's really critical that we look at the climate of refineries. And yeah, if you look at that page 17, that map of the United States, there's a couple things that, alarm bells should be going off. You look at the East Coast, Matt, look at all those states from Florida all the way up to Maine. You look at how much refining capacity there is in those states. Now compare that to the far fewer amount of states, Matt, in the Rockies. 5 states in the Rockies, which are far less populated.
Yeah, you were reading my mind. I'm like, you've got Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. I mean, combined, all
Utah and Colorado. Yeah, all 5 of these states have 700,000 barrels a day of refining capacity. And then you compare that, Matt, to the eastern, the East Coast, basically, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine. We have my goodness, probably 10 times the population on the East Coast, but there's only 900,000 barrels a day of refining capacity. So the East Coast is much more reliant on the global marketplace. Now, Florida has usually the lower part of that, Matt. Usually the lower part of this, what the East Coast is, which is Pad 1. It's a region of the country. Areas like Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas are supplied via massive pipelines, right? The Colonial Pipeline that connects from Texas. Major refineries feed that pipeline. So normally the bottom part of the East Coast is usually okay because there's such a large straw, we'll call it, that feeds what they sip, that gasoline. But usually it's the upper New England area, areas like Pennsylvania, New York. That pipeline that connects the Gulf Coast ends in Linden, New Jersey. And so normally the southern half of the East Coast does pretty well with that massive pipeline. But that means that the Northeast is reliant on refining capacity in Canada and overseas. So that could mean that the Northeast, we saw that in 2022 at the height of Russia's war in Ukraine, that the Northeast prices shot way above the national average because they are more subject to international prices because they don't have enough refining capacity.
So then my question, I have 2. So you are saying that we are importing gasoline into portions of the country, especially the Northeast, yes?
Yes, we do import some gasoline into there, primarily though heavier stuff like diesel and heating oil are the
imported.
2. Yeah.
Okay. So then my next question is, if the U.S. is producing so much oil, in fact, please correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't we in 2023, didn't we basically get more oil out of the ground than ever before? Or is that okay? So if we are producing that much oil from a consumer perspective, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask this from the perspective of somebody who's just, normally putting their card in at the pump and trying to figure out what's going on in the world. Why doesn't it make more sense to just build extra refining capacity, especially in the East Coast, where there's such a large population and they have the ability to produce so little fuel?
Well, there's not a whole lot of oil production happening there, so you need a major oil pipeline that could feed those refineries with oil. So that's the first reason why there aren't a whole lot of refineries there, is the oil has to get there, and that's a kink. Number 2, there was the loss of a major refinery, about 335,000 barrels a day. Refinery caught fire in Pennsylvania. So with that loss in 2019, we lost about a quarter of capacity there. The problem is getting oil into that market, Matt. There's a lot of problems with why refineries wouldn't want to build in that area. First of all, they need a reliable source of crude oil, which is more difficult in areas of the Northeast. Second thing is there's no existing refineries outside of this area. You don't just go and build a new oil refinery right now because the transition to EVs and because the political climate, right? There's a lot of people that don't want a refinery in their backyard. So the difficulty is that a refinery would probably need, a decade between conception and completion. So and in that decade, you've talked about a lot of states. I think New Jersey and New York are both states that are going to be banning the use of internal combustion engine vehicles after 2035. So already you have a shelf life on gasoline, right? They want to get rid of cars that need it. So why would an oil company build a refinery there? How could they supply it reliably? There's just a whole lot of issues with why refineries are probably not going to be built in that area of the woods. Political, not in my backyard approach. Nobody really wants one. So that's the difficulty. And oil companies don't want to build something that's not going to have a good return on investment. And in that area, with the transition to EVs, with a less than reliable supply of oil, or an international supply of oil, those are not the ingredients you'd want to build a refinery or to expand one. You could see expansions, but probably not.
So from a consumer perspective, the reason why we're seeing so much capacity in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast is because that's where the oil's coming out of the ground.
Access to oil. Yep.
Yes.
Big pipelines. And in the Gulf Coast, of course, you can bring it in, from international destinations. You can have that in the East Coast. But again, there's a lot of ingredients why, Texas is an area where not only they produce a lot of oil, but they import a lot of oil. Louisiana Offshore Oil Port is the biggest port that crude oil comes into the United States. So generally speaking, that's why a lot of the nation's refineries are in those two states. Not only is the offshore oil port in Louisiana, so it makes sense to have refineries right there, but also Texas is one of the biggest state when it comes to oil production. So put a lot of them there.
So the bigger aspect that I have to ask with regard to all of this, and you're talking about refineries in different states, banning this, that, and whatnot, transitioning to EV. That's all well and good, and that's fantastic. I'm going to sit there and say some of this has to be pie in the sky because you still have to have jet fuel. You still have to have other aspects because there is absolutely no way under any sun that I am looking at in any state of reality that you're going to magically pull all of the jets out of the sky and say, well, from this point, you've got to have electric jets. It's not even on the radar for 10 or 15 years from now, let alone 20 or 30. Plus, you have some states where it doesn't really matter if anybody likes what I'm about to say or not. It's just reality. And that's what you have to base things off of. Some states are just not conducive to EV vehicles as they are right now. You can increase the range to 500, 600 miles. That may be a different story. But right now, that is not, it is not something that is a physical reality. Things like Montana, for example, or the Plains states, Midwest, rural areas where you have to drive and drive and drive and drive just to get to your neighborhood grocery store. You have to drive an hour each way just to go get your weekly amount, an allotment of groceries. Alaska, for example. There are so many examples. Right. Now, if you're on the island of Maui, fine. You can probably get away with an EV, even today, on the mileage. Because you have a limited amount of miles you can drive in a daily basis. But the reality is in a lot of areas of the of the country, it is not feasible to sit there, and it's not based on a state of reality that you're going to be able to get away with an electric vehicle in its current capacity. So, I mean, yes, I can understand that if you want to create that, that transition. But I would argue, and I'm a nobody, and I understand that, but from a consumer perspective, I would argue that even New Jersey and these other ones saying by 2035, there's probably going to have to be some tweaking to that as it gets a little bit closer. I mean, they can sit there and put and throw the dart up against the wall all they want to. I think reality-based, you're going to have a situation where it's just not available. And it's like, well, what if they change the way that the EVs are made? That's great, but you're not going to be able to rebuild the power grid to be able to facilitate that kind of growth in electricity usage in rural areas that quickly either. You have to work, because if the electric grid is going to take the place of the refinery, then the electric grids are all going to have to be dramatically expanded in their capacity as well. And oh, by the way, they're being told to go into more of a environmentally friendly. Again, I have no issues with any of that. I think cleaner air is a great thing, but you have to build the capacity in there. And if you don't have the capacity there, especially in rural areas, that's not reality anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Matt, speaking about the EV transition, we have a couple slides in here that are rather interesting as well that talk about the risk to the transition to EVs. I mean, obviously, we have a major presidential election coming up in 2024, and policy could shift in a major way. That could cause consumers to slow the pace of trading in their internal combustion engine vehicle. Tax credits have been, all over the place when it comes to EVs. So if the pace of tax credit slows, if the infrastructure doesn't keep up, I mean, you're talking about a point in time here as we close out 2023. There are a lot of EVs sitting on lots of car dealerships that haven't been sold. And very quickly now, too, investors are starting to slow down, what they're investing in because there's so much money floating around. But consumers are not necessarily reacting to buying an EV now, especially with gas prices, Matt, predicted by us to be more affordable in 2024. So, why would people go out there and spend, 50? Boy, I don't even know what the cheapest EV is anymore, but I'm going to guess somewhere between 35 to 50. You still have a huge investment to make. And keep in mind, if battery technology changes, that's really going to drastically change things. So I think really interesting is a couple of slides. We added the EV transition outlook to our 20? Fuel outlook. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And look at the rise of electric vehicles. But again, there's a big risk in the pace shifting and slowing down depending on the outcome of the presidential elections. But getting back to gas prices, since that's our bread and butter, again, to underscore the fact that we're expecting gas prices to be a little bit tamer this year. And I would encourage folks to look in our forecast on page 10. Depending on which of the nation's 50 states you're in, you're going to be paying either quite a bit more. California, you're going to be paying an average of well over $4 a gallon for this year. Or you can be in a state like Texas, where you might on average spend between $288 and $318 for a yearly average this year. So there, Matt, we have to obviously, talk about the elephant in the room, how gasoline taxes vary.
Yes.
Coast to coast. And by the way, some good news if you're in Pennsylvania, because of the decline in wholesale gas prices, Pennsylvania motorists are going to be seeing their gas tax decrease with the drop of the ball by 4 cents a gallon. So good news for Pennsylvania motorists is that you're going to be spending a little bit less, not only from our prediction of lower prices in 2024, but you're going to be getting a little bit of a break when it comes to gasoline taxes. And that applies to diesel as well.
That's interesting. And if I am looking at this correctly with regard to all of that, I'm looking at page, I guess it's 15 now. And I don't know how I just created a dual screen on my PDF, but somehow I only have half a screen to be able to just suddenly look at it there. I'll undo that here in just a moment. But inflation, let's very quickly, 2023 has seen inflation start to slow as well. So can you talk to us about that? Obviously, the Federal Reserve is even signaling the concept of possibly lowering interest rates next year. What kind of an impact is that going to have in your thought process with regard to gas prices as well? Because it seems to be kind of linked together. The higher that you make inflation and or interest rates and other aspects, sometimes that has a little bit of an impact on gas prices.
Yeah, it really does. And it really depends, Matt, on the kind of the broader economic data. If the Fed starts cutting interest rates, it's likely because they've achieved a lot of their goals when it comes to slowing down inflation. And it could even mean that there's a slowdown in the economy, a broad enough slowdown in consumption that prices are modestly expected to decline. That's a wild card, though, because if the Fed cuts too much, right, there's a lot in their potential. If they cut interest rates too quickly, that could start to get the economy growing too rapidly. So it's going to be a delicate, it's got to be a delicate approach, but that has the potential of increasing demand slightly in the year ahead. And by the way, Matt, worth mentioning, for our forecast here, we do expect that gasoline demand will rebound slightly in 2024. We're expecting about a 2% increase in gasoline demand compared to 2023. Just to line that up, by the way, as we stand here closing out 2023, the Energy Information Administration has shown that implied, which is basically implied demand, which is kind of like a proxy for retail demand for gasoline is up 1.4% compared to last year. So we're expecting a little bit more of a modest increase this year. And part of the reason that we expect more of an increase in gasoline demand is because we do expect the Fed to start cutting interest rates, and we also expect gasoline prices to be more affordable in 2024. So we expect a modest increase in demand. So some of that, to your question about how interest rates, the Fed potentially cutting them impacts gas prices, we expect demand will be higher in 2024 for gasoline, and part of that because of the Fed. And we don't expect higher prices necessarily, but if the Fed does cut more aggressively, there is some upside risk. But it really depends on a lot of the other economic data that we're looking at.
So we have an election year for the president in 2024, and you always have politicians talking about in their campaigns and other aspects, whether it be wanting to go more green or wanting to provide better gas prices. You always have politicians weighing in on gas prices and trying to make them more affordable or trying to transition, whichever political party you're leaning. I'm not trying to take a side one way or the other. How much impact do you think that the presidential election and or even a change in administration would potentially have on these prices?
Yeah, I mean, it could be big, Matt. I mean, if you talk from going from President Biden, who has been openly critical of the oil industry, then flipping back to asking them to produce more. I mean, it's been kind of an interesting dynamic. But if you go to a Republican who have a track record of being more friendly to the oil industry, more conducive to allowing federal land to be used for drilling, that could have a drastic impact on energy prices going forward. It could mean higher oil production in the years ahead. It won't have an immediate impact, Matt. Keep in mind, we said that President Biden's policies won't have an immediate impact, but if there's a Republican, their policies probably won't have an immediate impact as well. It just depends on the manner of how they go things. If there are incentives, that could accelerate the impact of a potential policy shift, but it's not going to be overnight. But a change in administration could greatly alter gas prices going into 2025. So, as we look to this election year, there's a lot that could shift, from EVs to policies regarding oil production and other sorts of things. So that's going to be a major thing to watch, Matt, for later this year.
Definitely something to keep a very watchful eye on. I'm just curious because a lot of those things, over the course of 4 years, in the big scheme of things, it's kind of a drop in the bucket for the existence of our country. But 4 years, a lot can change depending upon the administration that is at the helm, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly something to keep an eye on. This time next year, we may be talking about something very different with regard to a lot of things for your 2025 forecast as a result on that.
There's a lot of different ways that the ship can be steered over the course of 4 years to end up in a completely different place, but it takes a long time to get there.
Do you ever get nervous to put out an annual forecast like this? Do you ever get like a little jitter kind of going, man, this could, I mean,
you want it to be right? It's,
right.
You want
it's
it
only
to be
your
accurate.
Reputation,
no big deal. Yeah,
no big deal.
I mean, there are certainly some things that, I hold my breath for the first month. And, you just realize that I think everything we've covered here, Matt, it's hard to predict everything. There certainly could be something that flares up. We've covered the potential downfalls, the wild cards, as I mentioned. 2023 saw some pipeline issues in Arizona. There were some refinery issues in California. There were refinery issues in the Corn Belt late this summer. So nobody knows how these events can, translate to differences at the pump. So, with this forecast, if people really read through this carefully, you'll know very quickly the risks. But yeah, I mean, certainly once it's published, Matt, it's out there. So I do get a little nervous about that.
So then my question for you, and as a kind of I know that we'll probably need to be wrapping this up eventually here on this particular special edition, but is there an asterisk that you would place on this forecast of something that you are most nervous about that could potentially impact what your forecast is?
Boy, Matt, there's a lot. I think the one thing that comes to the top of my mind at first is if, and not necessarily a risk for better or worse, but, there's been a lot said in recent weeks, OPEC policy. There could be some shifts there, and OPEC's still a major player when it comes to global oil production. So That and geopolitical shifts, I think, would be the things that geopolitical shifts are what maybe keep me up at night in regards to this forecast being accurate. And OPEC always keeps me on my toes.
Well, that is certainly something to keep in mind as we go into the year 2024, for sure. Anything else out there that you feel is very important out of this particular 2024 or 2024 forecast that you want to really highlight before we wrap things up?
Boy, Matt, you know what? After we said it all, I appreciate everyone who looks at this and all of our followers again as we wrap up 2023. I'm real hopeful that the forecast will nail it on the head. Hopefully it's way off, Matt. I'd rather have gas prices, to your point, be $1.99 throughout the year. So let's just hope it's we don't see another pandemic as the reason for me being so low. But I would love to see lower prices than we expect. But for now, we'll take another year of gas prices being lower than last year, right?
Oh, I'm still pushing for that $1.99 a gallon. I've given up. I've given up on the 99 cents, but I will take $1.99 because I'm just that way. I'm just
music
that way.
To our ears,
right? And speaking of music, I think we're about to wrap up for this particular edition of Over a Barrel. Patrick, what are the contact information that folks can really kind of get some questions in for us?
Yeah, Matt, check out our Over a Barrel Show handle on Twitter or Over a Barrel Show on Facebook as well. And you can, of course, email us to podcast@gasbuddy.com or ping me or Matt. I'm GasBuddy Guy on Twitter, and he's Over a Barrel Matt. We'd love to hear from you, especially on this forecast and into the new year.
I'm always over a barrel. Isn't that crazy?
That is.
Sometimes it's not gasoline, though. Anyway, all right, that's going to wrap up everything. Thanks so much for joining us here in Over a Barrel. And on behalf of Patrick and myself, Happy New Year.